baby's cry pierced the summer air as Rose Hamilton stepped out of the modest cottage, her copper-red hair catching the morning sunlight like fire. She bounced the fussing infant gently, whispering soft words in a voice that had once made a duke abandon all reason. "Hush now, little James, Mama's here." She didn't see the black stallion approaching through the peach orchard until it was almost upon her. When she looked up, her amber eyes widened in shock and the color drained from her freckled cheeks. Duke Alexander Sterling sat astride his horse like a conquering general, his steel blue gaze fixed on the child in her arms with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Hello, Rose." His voice was exactly as she remembered, deep, cultured, dangerous. 2 years had done nothing to diminish his devastating appeal. If anything, the scar above his left eyebrow and the hardness around his eyes made him even more striking. "Alexander," her voice barely rose above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He dismounted in one fluid motion, never taking his eyes off the baby. "I think you know exactly why I'm here." Little James chose that moment to turn his head toward the stranger, revealing a face that was unmistakably Sterling. The same dark hair, the same aristocratic features, the same piercing blue-gray eyes. "Dear God," Alexander breathed. "He's mine." Rose clutched the baby tighter, her heart pounding with terror and a love she'd thought buried forever. "You have no right to be here." "No right?" Alexander's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Rose, that child has my blood running through his veins. That gives me every right in the world." She backed toward the cottage, but Alexander followed, his presence filling the humble space like a storm cloud. 2 years, he said quietly. 2 years you've been hiding my son from me. He's not your son." The lie tasted like poison on her tongue. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with leather and something uniquely masculine that had once driven her mad with desire. "Rose, he has my eyes. My chin, even the way he holds his head." Alexander's voice cracked slightly. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own child?" James gurgled happily, reaching tiny fingers toward his father's face as if drawn by some invisible bond. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alexander whispered, his anger giving way to something rawer, more painful. "Why didn't you come to me when you knew you were carrying my child?" Rose met his gaze with defiant pain. "Because you were engaged to marry Lady Catherine Pemberton. Because you made it very clear that our arrangement was temporary." "Arrangement?" Alexander's face darkened. "Is that what you call what we had?" "What would you call it?" Rose's amber eyes blazed with old hurt. "A duke and a servant girl. A powerful man and his convenient mistress? What else could it have been?" The words hit Alexander like physical blows. "Rose, you got what you wanted from me, Alexander. And when it was time for you to do your duty and marry within your class, you did exactly that." Her voice broke slightly. "I wasn't going to trap you with a bastard child." "Trap me?" Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "Rose, if I had known, if you had told me—" "What? You would have married me instead." Rose laughed bitterly. "The Duke of Sterling marrying his father's scullery maid? Don't insult my intelligence." Alexander fell silent because deep down he knew she was right. 2 years ago he would have provided for her, supported the child, but marriage? That would have been unthinkable. But now, looking at his son, their son, and the woman who had borne him in secret, suffering alone rather than burden him with an inconvenient truth. "Where's your husband?" he asked quietly. Rose's chin lifted defiantly. "What husband?" "The child's supposed father. The man you must have married to. Give James a name." "There is no husband." Her voice was proud, unashamed. "I've raised James alone." Alexander felt something crack open in his chest. "Alone? For 2 years you've been raising my child alone?" "Our child," Rose corrected fiercely. "And yes, alone, because it was better than watching you torn between duty and desire. Better than being your guilty secret forever." Little James began to fuss, and Rose automatically began to rock him, her movements so natural and maternal that Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. "He's beautiful," Alexander whispered. "Our son is beautiful." "Yes," Rose said simply. "He is." They stood there in the cottage doorway, the weight of 2 years of separation and secrets hanging between them like morning mist. Alexander reached out slowly, and after a moment's hesitation, Rose allowed him to touch James's tiny hand. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around his father's, holding on with surprising strength. "Hello, son," Alexander murmured, and Rose saw tears threatening in those steel blue eyes. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." But as the morning sun climbed higher, Rose knew their peaceful moment couldn't last, because Alexander Sterling didn't ride alone anymore. In the distance, she could see other riders approaching, men in expensive clothes who could only be his retinue. And among them, seated in an elegant carriage, was a woman in blue silk whose presence would shatter their fragile reunion into 1,000 pieces. Lady Catherine Pemberton had come to reclaim her husband, and she had no intention of letting a peasant girl and her bastard child destroy everything she'd worked to build. The elegant carriage rolled to a stop in front of Rose's cottage with military precision, its gilded wheels kicking up dust that settled like judgment on the humble garden. Lady Catherine Pemberton emerged like a queen surveying conquered territory, her sapphire blue silk gown immaculate, despite the journey. Rose felt her stomach drop as she recognized the woman she'd seen only in portraits, golden blonde hair perfectly arranged, porcelain skin and ice-cold blue eyes that missed nothing. "Alexander, darling," Catherine's voice was honey over steel as she approached. "I see you found your distraction." Alexander stepped protectively in front of Rose and James, his jaw tightening. "Catherine, this is not what we discussed." "Isn't it?" Catherine's gaze fixed on the baby in Rose's arms with calculating interest. "You said you were coming to settle an old debt. I assumed that meant paying her off and sending her away." Rose felt heat flood her cheeks. "I don't want your money." "Of course you do," Catherine replied smoothly. "All women of your class eventually want money. The only question is how much." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a leather purse heavy with gold coins. $500, more than enough to relocate somewhere far from North Carolina and start fresh. "Catherine!" Alexander's voice was sharp with warning. "What?" "I'm being generous." Catherine's smile was razor-thin. $500 for a bastard child and his mother to disappear forever. Most duchesses wouldn't be nearly so accommodating. Little James began to cry, as if sensing the tension in the air. Rose bounced him gently, her amber eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "Your Grace," Rose said quietly, "with all due respect, my son and I are not problems to be solved with your husband's money." "Your son?" Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "My dear girl, that child is a Sterling. Look at him. He has Alexander's eyes, his chin, even his stubborn expression. He belongs with his father's family." Rose's arms tightened around James protectively. "He belongs with his mother." "Does he? A bastard child raised in poverty, denied his birthright, his education, his proper place in society?" Catherine stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "How selfish of you to keep him from everything he deserves, simply because you can't let go of a fantasy." "Fantasy?" Rose's voice was steady, but Alexander could see her hands trembling. "You think Alexander loves you? You think this," Catherine gestured dismissively at the humble cottage, "is some romantic fairy tale where the Duke abandons his responsibilities for a servant girl?" "Catherine, that's enough," Alexander warned. "Is it? Because I think Miss Hamilton needs to understand the reality of her situation." Catherine's blue eyes glittered with malice. "Alexander married me, not you. Alexander's legitimate children will bear the Sterling name and inherit the duchy. This child," she pointed at James, "will always be nothing more than an embarrassing reminder of his father's momentary lapse in judgment." Rose felt tears threatening, but she lifted her chin defiantly. At least he was conceived in love, not arranged like a business transaction. The slap echoed across the cottage yard like a gunshot. Catherine's hand had moved so quickly that even Alexander hadn't seen it coming. "How dare you!" Catherine's composure finally cracked, revealing the fury beneath her perfect exterior. Alexander moved between them instantly, his face dark with rage. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, Catherine, I'll forget you're my wife." "Your wife?" Catherine's voice rose to a near shriek. "Yes, Alexander, I am your wife. I've spent 2 years building your reputation in Washington society, managing your estates, hosting your political allies. And this is how you repay me, by running off to play house with your former mistress?" "Rose was never my mistress," Alexander said quietly, but with such intensity that both women stared at him. "What?" Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. Alexander looked at Rose, his steel blue eyes soft with memory and regret. "She was the woman I loved, the only woman I've ever loved." The words hung in the summer air like a thunderclap. Rose felt her heart stop, then start again with painful intensity. "Loved?" Catherine's face had gone white. "Alexander, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I said." Alexander's voice was steady. final. I married you because it was my duty. I made love to Rose because it was my choice. Catherine staggered backward, as if she'd been struck. This is impossible. Our marriage, our life together, was built on a foundation of obligation, not affection. You knew that when you accepted my proposal. Alexander's voice was not unkind, but utterly honest. We both understood it was a political alliance, nothing more. But I thought, over time, I believed you had come to care for me. I respect you, Catherine. I even admire you. But I never loved you. Rose watched this exchange with a mixture of wonder and terror. Hearing Alexander speak of love so openly, so definitively, made her heart soar and break simultaneously. Alexander, she said softly, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He turned to face her fully. Rose, 2 years ago I was a coward. I chose duty over love, obligation over happiness. I married Catherine because it was expected, because it was safe. He stepped closer, close enough to touch James's tiny hand again. But I never forgot you. I never stopped loving you. And I never stopped regretting the choice I made. You're married, Rose whispered. You have responsibilities. Yes, and my first responsibility is to my son. Alexander's voice grew stronger. James is my heir, legitimate marriage or not. He's a sterling, and he deserves everything that comes with that name. Catherine had found her voice again. You cannot seriously be suggesting. I'm suggesting nothing. I'm stating fact. Alexander faced his wife with cold determination. James will be acknowledged as my son. He will be educated as befits his station. And Rose, he paused, his eyes finding hers again. Rose will be treated with the respect due to the mother of my child. This is madness. Catherine's composure was completely shattered now. The scandal will destroy us. Your political career, our social standing, will survive or perish based on how we handle this situation. Alexander's voice was calm, reasonable. We can present a united front, a duchess graciously accepting her husband's natural son, or we can create a war that destroys everyone involved. Rose looked between husband and wife, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. You want me to be your kept woman, she said quietly. Acknowledged, respectable, but still hidden away while you maintain your marriage. I want you to be whatever you choose to be. Alexander's eyes held hers steadily. But I won't abandon our son again. And I won't pretend I don't love you. Little James gurgled happily, oblivious to the adult drama surrounding him. In his innocent contentment, Rose saw the future stretching before them, complicated, scandalous, but filled with love. But she also saw Catherine's face, twisted with hurt and fury, and knew their troubles were just beginning. Some women, Rose realized, would burn the world down rather than share what they considered theirs. And Catherine Pemberton was definitely that kind of woman. That evening, as the summer heat gave way to cool twilight, Rose found herself in an impossible situation. Catherine had retreated to the nearby inn with her entourage. Alexander had insisted on staying at the cottage to get to know his son, and the entire county was buzzing with whispers about the Duke and his scandalous visit. He's starting to teeth, Rose said softly, watching Alexander awkwardly hold James by the fireplace. That's why he's been fussing more lately. Alexander studied his son's face with wonder. How do you know these things? About teething and all of it? You learn quickly when you're alone. Rose's voice held no self-pity, just simple truth. Mrs. Henderson from the next farm helped me in the beginning, but mostly I figured it out as I went along. Alone, Alexander repeated, the word heavy with guilt. Rose, if I had known, you would have what? Left your wife? Abandoned your duties? Rose shook her head. Alexander, what's done is done. The question is what happens now. Before he could answer, urgent knocking erupted at the cottage door. Rose opened it to find young Tommy Henderson, the neighbor boy red-faced from running. Miss Rose, you need to know there's men coming. Armed men riding hard from town. Alexander was on his feet instantly, still holding James. What men? Sheriff Garrison and his deputies and... Tommy's eyes widened as he looked at Alexander. And some fancy gentleman from up north. They're saying you kidnapped that baby. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. Kidnapped? The lady in the blue dress. She went to the sheriff, said you stole her husband's heir and are holding him for ransom. Alexander's face went deadly pale. Catherine wouldn't dare. Wouldn't she? Rose snatched James from his arms, her maternal instincts blazing to life. She's a duchess, Alexander. I'm nobody. Who do you think the sheriff will believe? The sound of horses approaching fast made them all freeze. Through the window, Rose could see torches bobbing in the darkness. "Rose Hamilton!" Sheriff Garrison's voice boomed across the yard. "Come out with the child. You're under arrest for kidnapping." Alexander moved toward the door, but Rose caught his arm. "If you go out there, it makes everything worse. Catherine can claim you're being coerced, that I'm holding both of you against your will. I won't let them arrest you for protecting our son. Our son needs his mother free, not in jail." Rose's mind was racing. There has to be another way. Tommy tugged at her skirt. "Miss Rose, there's a back way through the woods. My pa uses it to avoid the main road when he's carrying things he shouldn't be." "Smuggling route?" "Yes, ma'am. Leads to the river, then to the Underground Railroad station. Those folks know how to hide people real good." Alexander stared at her. "Rose, you can't be serious. Running will only make you look guilty. Staying will get me hanged for a crime I didn't commit." Rose was already moving, grabbing a shawl and the small bag she kept packed from years of uncertainty. "At least if I run, James has a chance." The banging on the door grew more insistent. "Miss Hamilton, open up or we're coming in." Alexander caught Rose's face in his hands, his steel blue eyes desperate. "This is my fault. All of it. Let me fix this." "You can't fix this, Alexander. This is bigger than both of us now." Rose kissed him quickly, fiercely. "Take care of yourself, and don't let Catherine destroy what we had." She was at the back window when Alexander's voice stopped her. "Rose, wait. There's something you need to know." "What?" "Catherine isn't really my wife." The words hit like lightning. Rose turned slowly, James clutched against her chest. "What did you say?" "The marriage, it was never legally completed. Catherine's previous marriage to Lord Hartwell was never properly annulled. She's been living as a bigamist for 2 years. Rose felt the world tilt. "How long have you known?" "I found out 3 weeks ago. Her first husband surfaced in Boston, very much alive and very angry about being declared dead." Alexander's voice was rough with emotion. "I came here to tell you that we could be together, legally, properly. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? Catherine doesn't know I know. I wanted to tell you first, to ask if you could forgive me enough to consider being my wife." The banging on the front door turned into splintering wood. The sheriff wasn't waiting any longer. "Go," Alexander said urgently. "Take James and go. I'll handle Catherine and the sheriff." "How?" Alexander's smile was grim and determined. "By telling them the truth, all of it." Rose hesitated for one precious second, then climbed through the window into Tommy's waiting arms. As she disappeared into the dark woods with her son, she heard Alexander's voice from inside the cottage. "Sheriff Garrison, I'm Alexander Sterling, Duke of Sterling, and I need to report a fraud." Through the trees, Rose could hear the confusion and shouting that followed. Alexander was taking an enormous risk, exposing Catherine's bigamy publicly. It would create a scandal that would reach from North Carolina to Washington, but it would also free them both. As Rose followed Tommy through the moonlit forest, James sleeping peacefully in her arms, she realized that sometimes the only way to win an impossible game was to change the rules completely. Behind them, the cottage blazed with torchlight and angry voices. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous, uncertain, but filled with the possibility of freedom. And somewhere between the darkness behind and the hope ahead, Rose Hamilton began to believe in fairy tales again, even the kind that required running through the night to reach their happy ending. 3 days later, Rose found herself in the most unlikely of sanctuaries, a Quaker meeting house 30 miles from her cottage, hidden deep in the Carolina mountains. The families who ran this station of the Underground Railroad had welcomed her and James without question, asking only that she help with cooking and mending in exchange for safety. "The baby's father, he's a good man?" asked Martha Whitman, the elderly Quaker woman who'd become Rose's protector. They sat in the simple wooden kitchen, James sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle. "He is," Rose said softly, mending a torn shirt. "But good men don't always get to make the choices they want." "And what about thee? What choice will thee make when he comes for thee?" Rose looked up, startled. "What makes you think he'll come?" Martha's weathered hands never paused in their bread kneading. "Because that man rode through 3 counties asking every soul he met if they'd seen a red-haired woman with a baby. And because he's offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to thy safe return." $1,000? Rose felt her heart skip. "That's more money than most people see in a lifetime." "Aye, and yet not one person has claimed it. Curious thing that." Before Rose could ask what she meant, young Ezra Whitman burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, there's a whole group of fancy folks coming up the mountain road, and the lady in front—" He paused, looking at Rose. "She's madder than a wet cat." Rose's blood turned to ice. "Catherine." Martha moved to the window, her expression grim. "8 riders, and they're armed. How did she find me?" "Money talks, child, even to good people when they're desperate enough." Martha was already moving, her Quaker calm replaced by urgency. "Ezra, take Miss Rose and the baby to the root cellar, now." "No." Rose stood up, surprising them both. "I'm tired of running, tired of hiding. If Catherine wants a confrontation, she'll have one." "Rose, thee must think of thy son." "I am thinking of him. What kind of life will he have if his mother spends it cowering in cellars and running from shadows?" Rose smoothed her simple brown dress and checked that James was secure in her arms. 3 days of freedom had changed something fundamental in her spirit. She was no longer the frightened servant girl who'd hidden her pregnancy and raised her child in secret shame. She was a mother protecting her child, and that made her dangerous. The riders arrived in a thunder of hooves and jingling harnesses. Catherine dismounted with fluid grace, her traveling dress immaculate despite the rough journey. Behind her came Sheriff Garrison and several deputies, along with a thin man in expensive clothes who could only be a lawyer. "Mrs. Whitman," Catherine's voice was honey over steel as Martha opened the door. "I'm Duchess Catherine Sterling. I believe you're harboring a fugitive." "We harbor only those who need God's protection," Martha replied calmly. "How noble. But kidnapping is a crime against man's law, not God's." Catherine stepped forward. "I know she's here, and I know she has my husband's child. Your husband's child, perhaps, but not your child." Everyone turned as Rose appeared in the doorway, James in her arms, her copper hair catching the afternoon light like flame. Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Miss Hamilton, how good of you to save us a search." "Your Grace." Rose's voice was steady, respectful but not subservient. "You've come a long way for nothing." "Have I?" "Sheriff Garrison, arrest this woman for kidnapping." But the sheriff hesitated, his eyes moving between Catherine and Rose. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but there seems to be some confusion about the charges." "What confusion?" The sheriff cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, your husband came to see me yesterday. Had some interesting things to say about the situation." Catherine's face went pale. "What sort of things?" "He explained that Miss Hamilton here is the child's natural mother, and that she was fleeing an illegal arrest warrant." The sheriff's voice grew stronger. "He also had some very interesting documents about your previous marriage situation." "That's ridiculous. Alexander is my husband." "Actually," the thin lawyer spoke up for the first time, "I'm afraid Duke Sterling is correct. Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, you are under arrest for bigamy, fraud, and filing false charges." Catherine staggered backward as if struck. "This is impossible. Lord Hartwell is dead. I have the death certificate." "Forged, I'm afraid. Lord Hartwell surfaced in Boston last week, very much alive and very angry about being declared dead for your convenience." Rose watched Catherine's perfect composure crumble completely. "But our marriage, our life together, was built on lies from the very beginning." Alexander's voice cut through the mountain air as he rode up the path, his black stallion gleaming in the sunlight. Rose's heart stopped, then started again with painful intensity. He looked magnificent and terrible, like an avenging angel come to set the world right. "Alexander," Catherine turned to him with desperate hope, "tell them this is all a mistake." "The only mistake was allowing your deception to continue for 2 years." Alexander dismounted, his steel blue eyes finding Rose's face across the yard. "Sheriff, please escort Mrs. Hartwell back to town. I believe the authorities in Boston are eager to speak with her." As the sheriff led a protesting Catherine away, Alexander approached the Quaker meeting house slowly, as if Rose might bolt again. "Hello, Rose." "Hello, Alexander." "May I—" He gestured toward James. "May I see my son?" Rose stepped forward, and for the first time in 3 days allowed Alexander to hold their child. James gurgled happily, his tiny hands reaching for his father's face. "He missed you," Rose said softly. "And his mother. Did she miss me too?" Rose met his eyes steadily. "His mother spent 3 days trying to convince herself she could live without you." "And what did she decide?" "That she's a terrible liar." Alexander's laugh was rich and warm. "Rose Hamilton, will you marry me? Not as a duke and his convenient solution, not as a political alliance, but as a man desperately in love with the woman who gave him the most precious gift in the world. Alexander, the scandal will fade, but our love, our family, that will last forever." Rose looked around at the simple Quaker meeting house, at Martha and Ezra watching with warm smiles. at the man who had risked everything to find her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Alexander kissed her with James nestled safely between them, Rose realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories required the darkest chapters to reach their brightest endings, and sometimes running away was really just running toward the life you were always meant to live. 2 weeks later, what was meant to be a simple wedding ceremony at the Quaker meeting house exploded into chaos when an unexpected guest arrived just as Rose and Alexander were about to exchange vows. "Stop this farce immediately!" The voice boomed across the peaceful gathering as Lord Hartwell himself strode into the meeting house, flanked by federal marshals and looking very much alive and furious. Rose felt Alexander's hand tighten on hers as they stood before the Quaker minister. James, held by Martha Whitman in the front row, began to fuss as if sensing the tension. "Lord Hartwell," Alexander said calmly, though his jaw was tight, "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't." Hartwell was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and cold grey eyes. "Considering you've been spreading lies about my wife. Your wife is a bigamist who—" "My wife," Hartwell interrupted, "is the victim of a conspiracy, and I have proof." He gestured to one of the marshals who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Federal Marshal Davies, if you would read the charges." "Alexander Sterling, Duke of Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and unlawful imprisonment." Rose felt the world tilt around her. "What?" "It seems," Lord Hartwell continued with satisfaction, "that my dear wife Catherine has been working with federal investigators for months, gathering evidence of the Duke's illegal activities." "That's impossible," Rose breathed. "Is it? Miss Hamilton, did you know your lover has been using his shipping business to smuggle contraband weapons to Confederate sympathizers? Did you know he's been falsifying government contracts and selling information to foreign agents?" The accusations hit like physical blows. Rose looked at Alexander, searching his face for denial, for anything that would make this nightmare stop. "Alexander, tell him he's lying." Alexander's silence stretched unbearably long. "Some of it is true," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Rose felt her heart shatter. "Which parts?" "The weapons. Not for Confederate sympathizers, for abolitionists. I've been secretly funding the Underground Railroad, providing arms for escaped slaves to defend themselves." Alexander's eyes met hers desperately. "Rose, everything I did was to fight slavery, to help people like the ones who protected you and James." "Noble intentions," Lord Hartwell sneered. "But still treason." Marshal Davies stepped forward. "Duke Sterling, you'll come with us now." "Wait!" Rose's voice cut through the chaos. "Lord Hartwell, if Catherine was gathering evidence against Alexander, why did she run when her bigamy was exposed? Why is she in jail awaiting trial?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Hartwell's face. "Temporary complications. She'll be released once this matter is resolved." "No, she won't." Martha Whitman stood up slowly, her Quaker bonnet framing her weathered face. "Because Catherine Sterling or Catherine Hartwell, whatever name she chooses, made one fatal mistake." "What mistake?" Marshal Davies demanded. Martha reached into her apron and withdrew a folded document. "She tried to bribe me to turn Miss Rose over to bounty hunters, and she put that offer in writing." The meeting house fell silent, except for James's soft babbling. "The letter details her plan to have Miss Rose and the baby killed, making it look like an accident. She wanted to eliminate any threat to her position as the Duke's wife." Martha's voice was steady, implacable. "I believe federal law takes a dim view of conspiracy to commit murder." Lord Hartwell's face went ashen. That can't be true. Read it yourself." Martha handed him the letter. As Hartwell read, his expression changed from confidence to horror to rage. "This is—" "Catherine wrote this?" "In her own hand, signed and dated." Alexander stared at Martha in shock. "You had this evidence all along." "We Quakers believe in peace, but we also believe in justice. I was waiting for the right moment." Martha's eyes were kind but determined. "Seemed like thy wedding day was appropriate." Marshal Davies took the letter from Hartwell's trembling hands and read it quickly. His face hardened. "Lord Hartwell, I'm afraid there's been a significant development in this case. This letter suggests that your wife has been manipulating federal investigations for personal gain. But the charges against Sterling will need to be reviewed in light of this evidence. If Mrs. Hartwell fabricated or exaggerated evidence to eliminate a romantic rival—" The Marshal shook his head grimly. "Duke Sterling, you're still under investigation, but you won't be arrested today." Rose felt weak with relief. But the nightmare wasn't over. "There's more," Martha continued. "Show them the second letter, Ezra." Her son stepped forward with another document. "This one came 2 days ago, from Catherine herself." Alexander took the letter with shaking hands and read aloud. "If you're reading this, my plans have failed. I cannot bear the thought of Alexander with another woman, raising another woman's child as his heir. If I cannot have him, no one can. I have poisoned the well at Rose's cottage. By the time you find this letter, they will all be dead. Perhaps in death, Alexander will remember why he married me instead of her." The silence that followed was deafening. Rose sank onto the nearest bench, her mind reeling. "She tried to poison us?" "The well was contaminated with arsenic," Ezra confirmed. "We had it tested when strange animals started dying near thy cottage." Lord Hartwell looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "My wife, my Catherine, she's a murderer. And you helped her nearly destroy an innocent family." Alexander's voice was cold as winter. "All because you couldn't accept that she'd moved on from your marriage." Marshal Davies was already organizing his men. "Lord Hartwell, I'm placing you under arrest as an accessory. Your interference with a federal investigation has compromised justice and nearly resulted in multiple murders." As the marshals led Hartwell away, the meeting house gradually emptied until only Rose, Alexander, Martha, and James remained. "Alexander," Rose said quietly, "the weapons smuggling was real. I've been funding abolitionists for 3 years, ever since I realized the government wasn't moving fast enough to end slavery." He knelt beside her bench. "I know it was illegal. I know it put us all at risk. But Rose, I couldn't stand by and watch people suffer when I had the power to help." Rose looked at this man, this complicated, passionate, flawed man who had risked everything for love and justice. "You beautiful, dangerous fool," she whispered. "Does that mean you'll still marry me?" Rose looked around the simple meeting house where they'd planned to exchange vows, where they'd nearly lost everything, where the truth had finally set them free. "Martha," she called to the Quaker woman, "is your minister still available?" Martha smiled. "I believe he is." "Then let's finish what we started." As Alexander swept her into his arms and James gurgled happily from Martha's lap, Rose realized that sometimes the most beautiful weddings are the ones that survive attempted murder, federal arrest, and the complete destruction of everything you thought you knew about your life. Because if love could survive all that, it could survive anything. 6 months after their dramatic wedding at the Quaker Meeting House, Rose Sterling, she still marveled at her new name, stood on the veranda of their rebuilt home, watching Alexander teach 18-month-old James to take his first steps across the wide porch. "Come on, son, just 3 more steps to Papa." James giggled and toddled forward on chubby legs, his copper-red curls bouncing with each determined step. When he reached Alexander's outstretched arms, both father and son erupted in celebration. "Did you see that, Rose? He walked all by himself." Rose smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child grew strong and healthy. "I saw. Our son is as stubborn as his father." The new house was nothing like the grand Sterling estates Alexander had grown up in. It was smaller, simpler, but filled with more genuine happiness than any mansion. After his cooperation with federal investigators led to the exposure of a major slavery conspiracy, Alexander had been pardoned for his weapons smuggling. The government, embarrassed by Catherine's manipulation of their investigation, had quietly dropped all charges. Catherine herself remained in federal prison, her trial having revealed the full extent of her murderous schemes. Lord Hartwell had died in custody, some said from shame, others from a broken heart. Rose tried to feel pity for them, but mostly she felt grateful that their darkness was finally behind them. "Any word from Martha today?" Alexander asked, settling James on his lap as they rocked in matching chairs. "A letter came this morning. The newest group of refugees made it safely to Canada, 12 families including the Washingtons with their new baby." Alexander nodded with satisfaction. They'd used Catherine's failed dowry, money that legally reverted to Alexander after her imprisonment, to establish a legitimate aid society for escaped slaves. It was dangerous work, but legal now, and deeply fulfilling. "Speaking of babies," Rose said softly, "Dr. Henderson stopped by while you were in town. Is everything well with your pregnancy?" "More than well." Rose's smile was radiant. "Alexander, we're having twins." Alexander nearly dropped James in his shock. "Twins?" "A boy and a girl, according to the doctor's examination, both healthy and active." She laughed at his stunned expression. "Very active. I think they're already competing for space." Alexander set James down carefully and moved to kneel beside Rose's chair, his hands gentle on her belly. "Twins," he repeated wonderingly. "Rose, are you sure you're ready for 3 children under 2 years old? Are you sure you're ready?" she countered. "You're the one who insisted on building that enormous nursery. I had a feeling we'd need the space." Alexander's eyes were soft with love and amazement. "Our family is growing so fast, growing and thriving." Rose covered his hands with hers. "Alexander, sometimes I can't believe this is our life. A year ago I was hiding in shame, raising James alone, convinced I'd never see you again. A year ago, I was trapped in a loveless marriage, believing I'd lost you forever." Alexander's voice was thick with emotion. "Look at us now." They were interrupted by the sound of a carriage approaching. Phillips, their former butler who had chosen to follow them to their new, simpler life, emerged from the house to greet the visitors. "Your Grace, Mrs. Sterling," he announced with dignity, "you have guests from Washington." Rose and Alexander exchanged glances. Official visitors still made them nervous, given their recent legal troubles. But the man who emerged from the carriage was smiling broadly. Senator Charles Whitman, Martha's eldest son, who had become a powerful advocate for abolition. "Alexander! Rose!" Charles approached with outstretched arms. "Congratulations on your growing family." "Charles, what brings you all the way from Washington?" Alexander asked, shaking his friend's hand. "Official business, actually. Very good official business." Charles's eyes twinkled. "The president wants to offer you a position, Alexander. Secretary of Internal Improvements. Full pardon, complete restoration of your social standing, and a salary that would make your old duchy look modest." Alexander stared at him. "The president wants to hire me. After everything that happened? Because of everything that happened. Your work with the Underground Railroad, your willingness to sacrifice personal gain for moral principle, you've become something of a hero in reform circles." Charles pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a formal offer. You'd be in charge of developing infrastructure projects that would help integrate freed slaves into American society." Rose felt her heart swell with pride. "Alexander, this is everything you've worked for." "It would mean moving to Washington," Alexander said slowly. "Leaving all of this." "Actually," Charles grinned, "it would mean keeping all of this. The position allows for remote work, given that most infrastructure projects are in rural areas anyway. You'd travel when needed, but you could base yourselves anywhere you choose." James chose that moment to toddle over and grab Charles's expensive trousers with sticky hands, babbling happily. "And this little one would grow up knowing his father is helping rebuild the country." Alexander looked at Rose, his eyes asking the question he didn't need to voice. "What do you think, Mrs. Sterling? Ready to help change the world?" Rose thought about the scared, isolated girl she'd been just a year ago. Then she looked at her husband, her son, and felt the twins moving actively in her belly. "I think we're ready for whatever comes next. Together." That evening, as they celebrated with the Quaker community that had become their chosen family, Rose found herself dancing with Alexander in the simple meeting house where they'd been married. James slept peacefully in Martha's arms, and their friends' laughter filled the air. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked as they swayed to the fiddle music, "giving up the quiet life for all this chaos and adventure?" "Never." Rose's answer was immediate and certain. "Alexander, a year ago I thought love was about hiding, about staying small and safe. You taught me that real love is about growing, about becoming bigger and braver and more than you ever thought possible." "You taught me something too," Alexander said, spinning her gently. "You taught me that titles and wealth don't make a man noble. Choosing love over fear does. Protecting your family does. Fighting for what's right, even when it costs everything." As the music swirled around them and their community celebrated their good fortune, Rose realized that their story had become exactly what she'd always dreamed of. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth every struggle. "Alexander," she whispered against his ear as they danced, "I love our complicated, chaotic, beautiful life, even with twins coming and a new job and all the uncertainty ahead. Especially with all of that, because we're facing it together." The fiddle music rose to a crescendo, and as Alexander spun Rose one final time, she caught a glimpse of their future. Children laughing in a house filled with love, meaningful work that made the world better, and a partnership strong enough to weather any storm. Some love stories, she thought as Alexander dipped her dramatically to the cheers of their friends, are worth waiting for, and some are worth fighting for. But the very best love stories are the ones where two people decide to build something beautiful together, no matter how impossible it seems at the beginning. Their beginning had been impossible. Their ending was going to be extraordinary. 10 years later, spring 1863, the Sterling family farm had become legendary throughout North Carolina, though not for the reasons most people expected. What had begun as a simple homestead was now a thriving community that served as a beacon of hope during America's darkest hours. Rose Sterling, now 34, stood in the doorway of their expanded farmhouse, watching her extraordinary family with the contentment that came from a life well lived. Her copper hair, now touched with premature silver from years of adventure and purpose, was pulled back in a practical bun as she observed the controlled chaos of a Sunday morning. "Mama, James won't let me help with the horses." 10-year-old James had grown into a miniature version of his father, dark hair, steel blue eyes, and a protective streak a mile wide when it came to his younger siblings. "That's because you're too little, Emma," James called back to his auburn-haired sister, who at 9 years old was already showing signs of inheriting her mother's stubborn determination. "I am not too little. Tell him, Mama." Rose smiled as Alexander emerged from the barn, leading 2 gentle mares and carrying their youngest son, 5-year-old Michael, on his shoulders. At 41, Alexander had aged gracefully into his role as a father and reformer. His hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face bore the lines of a man who laughed often and worried about important things. "Your father will settle it," Rose called out diplomatically. Alexander set Michael down and watched with amusement as all 3 children began talking at once. Over the years, he'd learned that parenting was like diplomacy. Everyone got to state their case, but ultimately the adults had to make the hard decisions. "James, your sister is old enough to help with gentle chores. Emma, your brother has the right to ensure everyone's safety. Michael," he paused as their youngest son tugged at his trouser leg. "What's your contribution to this debate?" "I think we should have pancakes for breakfast," Michael announced solemnly. Rose laughed, the sound bright and free. "Spoken like a true politician, you'll fit right in when we visit Washington next month." Their work with the government's reconstruction efforts had made the Sterling name synonymous with progress and compassion. Alexander's infrastructure projects had helped establish schools, hospitals, and businesses in communities across the South, while Rose had become an unofficial ambassador to women's rights groups and educational reform organizations. But their most important work happened right here on the farm, which had quietly become a crucial stop on the Underground Railroad and later a refuge for displaced families during the war. "Papa?" Emma asked as they walked toward the house for breakfast. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you'll speak at the town meeting next week about the new school plans. What do you think I should tell her?" Emma considered this with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice. "I think you should say yes, because education is the foundation of freedom." Alexander exchanged a look with Rose over their daughter's head. Emma had been quoting political philosophy since she was 6 years old. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "From Mama. She said it to the Ladies' Society last month." Rose felt her cheeks warm. "You were supposed to be napping during that meeting." "I was learning instead. Learning is more important than napping." As they settled around the large wooden table Alexander had built himself, Rose marveled at the everyday miracle of their family breakfast. James was reading aloud from the newspaper, discussing the war with the gravity of a military strategist. Emma was sketching architectural plans for her ideal schoolhouse on a piece of brown paper. Michael was constructing elaborate structures out of his pancakes. "Any interesting news?" Alexander asked, pouring coffee for himself and Rose. "President Lincoln signed another proclamation about Reconstruction," James reported, "and there's an article about our farm. Listen to this. The Sterling family demonstrates that true patriotism lies not in grand gestures, but in daily acts of courage, compassion, and community building." Rose nearly choked on her coffee. "They wrote an article about us. A very flattering one. They mention your literacy programs, Papa's infrastructure work, and how we've helped over 200 families find new homes and employment." James looked up from the paper. "Are we famous?" "We're fortunate," Alexander corrected gently. "Famous and fortunate are very different things." After breakfast, as the children scattered to their various Sunday activities, James to help with the animals, Emma to her drawing, Michael to build elaborate fortifications in the sandbox, Rose and Alexander found themselves alone on the front porch they'd shared through a decade of joys and struggles. "Do you remember," Rose asked, settling into the rocking chair that had become her favorite spot, "when you first came looking for James, when you thought our biggest problem was explaining his parentage to society?" Alexander laughed, pulling his own chair closer to hers. If someone had told me then that we'd end up here, married, raising 3 children, working with the federal government, and somehow becoming accidental celebrities, I'd have thought they were mad. Accidental celebrities who are about to become accidental grandparents. Alexander's chair stopped rocking. What did you just say? Rose's smile was radiant. James received a letter yesterday from a young woman in Virginia. It seems our eldest son has been corresponding with the daughter of one of the families we helped relocate 3 years ago. James is only 19, the same age you were when you first fell in love with a servant girl, Rose pointed out gently. Alexander groaned dramatically. He's too young to be serious about anyone. He's serious about her education first. He wants to wait until she finishes her teaching degree before proposing. Very responsible, actually. Responsible? Alexander stared at his wife. Rose, our baby is planning to propose to someone. Our baby is a grown man with excellent judgment and a good heart. Remind you of anyone? Before Alexander could respond, a familiar voice called out from the road. Rose, Alexander, are you receiving visitors? They looked up to see Martha Whitman approaching in her simple wagon, her hair now completely white, but her step as steady as ever. Behind her rode a young man in a Union Army uniform. Martha! Rose jumped up to embrace her old friend. What brings you here? And who's this handsome soldier? This is my grandson, David. He's home on leave and wanted to meet the famous Sterling family. David Whitman dismounted with military precision and approached with a shy smile. Mrs. Sterling, sir, it's an honor. Your work with displaced families helped my unit establish 3 new settlements in Tennessee. Our work is just continuing what your grandmother started, Alexander said, shaking the young man's hand. The Quakers have been the real heroes of this war. As they settled on the porch with lemonade and Martha's homemade cookies, Rose found herself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. 10 years ago, she'd been a frightened girl hiding her pregnancy. Now she was a wife, mother, advocate, and apparently, according to the newspaper, some kind of inspiration. Martha, she said as the afternoon sun slanted across their peaceful valley, do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently? If Catherine's schemes had succeeded, or if Alexander had never found us? Martha's weathered hands were steady as she poured more lemonade. Child, I've learned that wondering about different paths is like worrying about roads not taken. The only path that matters is the one you're walking right now. And what do you think of our path? Martha looked around at the thriving farm, the happy children playing in the yard, the couple who had built something beautiful out of seemingly impossible circumstances. I think, she said with a smile, that thee has found thy way home. And that home isn't a place, it's the people you choose to love and the life you choose to build together. That evening, as the family gathered for their traditional Sunday night storytelling, Rose found herself holding their newest addition, a tiny kitten that Michael had rescued from the barn, and declared, part of the family. Tell us the story about when Papa came looking for baby James, Emma requested as she did every Sunday. You've heard that story 100 times, James protested, though he was smiling. It's the best story, Michael declared, because it's true and it has a happy ending. Rose looked at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly. Once upon a time, she began, settling the kitten in her lap, there was a scared young woman who thought love was something that happened to other people. She had a beautiful baby boy, but she was raising him all alone because she thought that was what love required, sacrifice and secrecy and staying small. That's the sad part, Emma whispered. Yes, that's the sad part. But then one day the baby's father came looking for them, not because he wanted to take the baby away, but because he'd learned that real love isn't about having everything perfect. It's about choosing to build something beautiful together, even when the world tells you it's impossible. And they lived happily ever after, Michael asked, even though he knew the answer. They lived truthfully ever after, Rose corrected gently, which is even better than happily, because happy comes and goes, but truth, love built on truth, lasts forever. As the children drifted off to bed and Alexander banked the fire for the night, Rose stood at their bedroom window, looking out over the land they'd built their lives on. Any regrets? Alexander asked, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. Only one, she said, leaning back against his chest. What's that? I regret that it took us so long to find each other. But then I remember, we found each other exactly when we needed to, when we were both ready to choose love over fear. And now, Rose turned in his arms, her amber eyes bright with contentment and anticipation. Now we get to watch our children choose love over fear, and hopefully, we get to help a few more people do the same. Outside their window, the North Carolina mountains stood eternal and peaceful under a canopy of stars. Inside their home, 3 children slept safely, dreaming of futures bright with possibility. And in their bedroom, 2 people who had once thought love was impossible held each other and marveled at the extraordinary life they'd built together. One choice, one day, one act of courage at a time. Some love stories end with happily ever after. The best love stories end with truthfully ever after. And that's an ending that never really ends at all. What do you think of this story? Leave a comment and give it a like if it moved you. Share it so more people can see it.